afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this special debate at the conference of the Department of Trade and Industry, the Africa Dialogue Series 2012. In this particular session, we are discussing the African consumer and also the lessons that were picked up during the debate over the past 2 days. I just thought before we start, I'll give you a perspective on just who we're talking about. We're of course talking about a continent of 1 billion people, and we're talking about a continent with a combined GDP of $1.6 trillion US. We're talking also about a continent that is growing at the fastest pace in decades and faster than any other region, apart of course from Asia, and with 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world. We're talking about Africa, and the question is really, how do we harness this growth and make sure that it benefits the majority of our people who we know are mired in poverty across the continent? Now, to help me answer that question, I've got a panel here, and it's a very eminent panel. I'll just begin by introducing them. From my left, I have got the Minister of Trade and Industry from Ghana, Ms. Hannah Tete. Minister, thank you, and thank you for coming. We also have Minister Aaron Motsoaledi. He is the Minister of Health, South Africa. Dr. Rob Davies, our host here, Minister of Trade and Industry, South Africa. And then we also have Minister Tapiwa Mashakara, is Economic Planning and Investment Promotion from Zimbabwe, as well as finally, but not least, our business person on the panel today is Africa Executive for Adcock Ingram, Mr. Kofi Amegashi. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Let me begin by respecting the lady on my left. Ghana is, of course, the fastest growing economy in Africa. Everybody knows that, in part due to the recent discovery of oil. From where you stand, to ensure that Ghana is part of the African story, and when we talk about Africa, we talk about Ghana and its integration within the African economy. What practical steps can we be taking to ensure that we reach those critical masses in Africa as Ghana grows?
Thank you very much. When you talk about Ghana and the African story, the way we see ourselves is that we are integral to the African story. But so is every other African country. And I think that the things we need to do, by and large, are very similar. And we've discussed in this conference over the last couple of days, investing in people, investing in infrastructure, being able to encourage industrialization, enhancing regional integration so that it becomes more meaningful, creating opportunities for Africans to trade amongst ourselves and not just trading with Western partners and with other partners. And doing basically the actions that are going to help the African economy to become deeper, stronger, more vibrant, and create jobs for all of those young people who are coming up and who will demand that we should be able to take care of their needs. But when you look at the economic side, you must also look at the social side. Sure. Because you must also think about investing in the future. And that's why investing in people, investing in education becomes critical. In Ghana, over 10 years ago, we decided that it was important for us to invest in education. And because of that, we added an additional 2.5% to our VAT to fund the Ghana Education Trust, so that annually, in addition to budgeted funds for the Ministry of Education, we also have that fund to invest in educational infrastructure. Right. Among other things, I think it's important for us to focus on building up our human resource, creating new infrastructure, creating opportunities for industrialization, and not just look at ourselves as possibly a new service area. Over the last 2 years, the services sector has been the greatest contributor to Ghana's GDP, overtaking agriculture. But given the lessons that we've learned from the most recent economic crisis in other parts of the world, services can't be everything. And I think for me, those would be my first thoughts on the matter.
Indeed. Thank you, Minister. We do know, of course, one of the biggest problems that Africa has been facing is that we have growth, but in many cases it's been jobless growth. How do we then make sure that as we grow, we take with us the populations that we have with us? You mentioned an important point. One of Africa's biggest indictments is that we have got the resources, but in many cases we end up, those resources coming back, beneficiated without a benefit to Africa. Minister Davies, I want to throw this question to you. How do we add value to our products so that the factories that are in Europe and in Asia and in America that are producing and processing our raw materials are actually centered right here in Africa? And we do not import oil and refined oil products for our services when we produce the oil itself ourselves.
Well, I do think that this is the fundamental challenge for Africa as we move ahead, is how do we turn the growth spurt that we've had, which has had a consumption-driven element to it, how do we turn that into a sustainable developmental process, which does mean industrialization? So it means enhancing the consumer power that we have in individual African countries through creating integrated regional markets and then using those integrated regional markets and the demand which is behind those integrated markets as a tool to promote productive sector development. I think that is fundamentally what the challenge is in the African continent. And that's the reason we talk about development integration and not just trade integration. I think at the moment our picture is one where African consumers are increasing their consumer power, but not necessarily are they getting a good deal. Many times I think African countries are receiving the back end of what's produced, substandard, low-quality goods which are imported, and we may get some service jobs off that, but I think we get many more service jobs, and I think this is what research shows if we have the manufacturing, because the job multipliers are much bigger. I want to give, I mean, there's a number of examples, but I just want to give one. That we've had a lot of discussion in these last 2 days about ICT, and that was the last wave of industrial development. But Africa largely related to ICT as service providers of somebody else's manufactured products. The next wave of industrialization is green industrialization. That includes renewable energy and things of that sort. Now in South Africa we've taken a decision that we will generate 1/4 of our new output of energy from renewable sources, and we've chosen a big enough scale to support manufacturing. We don't just want to be the plumbers and installers of somebody else's solar water heaters, somebody else's solar panels, somebody else's windmills and so on and so forth. We actually need to start to manufacture those things in our country. So it's a question of harnessing that consumer power to create industrial development. Industrial development creates jobs, and it's job creation fundamentally. I think that is the tool that we need to move forward if we're going to reduce poverty and therefore inequality across the continent.
Yeah, Minister, I hear you. So the conversation has moved beyond resources. We're now talking about a service sector that's coming up, and of course the need to develop the manufacturing sector. Now, let me pose this question to Minister Mashakada. Now, when we're bringing in the service sector and we're growing our manufacturing sector, the key question is how do we make it sustainable? The Minister speaks about the need to ensure that we integrate and create the economies as well as the populations and demand that we need to be able to satisfy. Now, how do we create those integrated blocks so we create a customer base that's big enough to enable industries and manufacturers to manufacture and flourish?
I think the tragedy of Africa is that our economies are modeled as enclave economies. By enclave economies, I mean a situation where 20% of the population are participating in the formal sector of the economy, and the 80% of any economy are bordering on the informal sector, the communal sector, and other unbankable sectors. Therefore, they don't have the means and capacity to consume what has been produced in their own countries. It's my humble view that we need to expand our economies horizontally so as to capture people who have been marginalized from the mainstream economy, from the formal economy, so as to create the necessary service demand base in order to kickstart growth and development in Africa. For as long as the demand structure is driven by a narrow enclave economy, which focuses on the formal sector, the majority of our people remain excluded, and therefore the demand is dampened.
So we need to bring the informal sector into the formal sector. We need to break down these barriers, and we need to create bigger markets. Let me come to you, Minister Motsoaledi. Now, you, of course, are in the important position where you need to ensure that the workforce that we require for the industries that we're talking about is healthy. And yet, when you look at the spend on health across Africa, it's uneven. In some cases, it is good. In South Africa, it is growing, and there's said to be more that's devoted to it. But do we have a continent-wide plan that will ensure that the people that we need to be working in the factories, in the mines, are there and are healthy?
Indeed, that's the problem that we are faced with on the continent of Africa. that ill health is unfortunately growing.
Sure.
We are carrying disproportionately the scourge of HIV, AIDS, and TB, meningitis, pneumonia. Most communicable diseases are carried by this continent.
We begin from a backlog. We begin with a step behind.
Yes, we are definitely a step behind. We definitely need a Marshall Plan. What becomes even more painful is that, having said so, even the drugs we consume are not manufactured here on the continent. We're the biggest consumers of all these drugs, of communicable diseases. But we can't appreciably show pharmaceuticals which are homegrown to do that. We actually have to import, and that's what
we have got one of them sitting at the table. They make quite a range of drugs across the continent at Ingram, and we're coming to him now.
Yes. Well, I'm not sure about what I'm trying to say is that we're not satisfied that has been done appreciably on the continent, and we want things like TRIPS to be looked at so that the continent can be self-sufficient. In other words, we must be manufacturers of what we consume, because it can't go on like this. And finally, we know very well that ill health is bad for business. I'm sure you know that. Although excessive business can also be bad for health.
Indeed.
And we need to strike a balance on those. Thank you.
Mr. Magashi, I don't need to put the question. I think you've just said the question yourself. How do we ensure that we are producing these medicines in Africa ourselves?
I think the debate about private and public healthcare is one that's been going on for a while. And it's not really a debate about whether the private sector should be involved, but how best, because we all have a common goal of providing acceptable, affordable, and available healthcare to the majority of our people, and by that, more efficient, better resources for more people.
Affordable. I like the word affordable and efficient.
Absolutely, and that's important because our markets across the continent are small, right, by geography. And we've got to be able to create the environment for harmonization of regulation across markets at the sub-regional level first. Free movement of goods. We have customs unions in place that on paper sound very good, but practically they don't work. It's easier to take product from South Africa to Ghana by air than from Togo to Ghana, because two different laws, etc. Right? So as manufacturers, scale is vitally important for us. We've got to be able to create that, and that's not private sector or public sector or government's responsibility, and it's a joint effort. We've got to sit together to begin to say, how do we create scalable markets? And integration is good on paper, etc., but practically, how do you get a customs officer at their flower border to actually allow you to bring product across the border when it is legal?
Yeah, it is a very important question, and it is a question that came up in one of our debates in CNBC Africa, where we were talking about trying to create these markets that are scalable and sustainable to ensure businesses are enough people to try and sell to. And Minister Davis, I'm going to come to you, and Minister Mashakada, I'll come to you because it concerns regional integration. But let me begin with the Minister of Ghana here and talk about the institutions that we need to create the regional trading blocks that will enable us to bring Africa and make it one market. Currently, we have these structures that have been put in place, and Minister Davis has been a great servant in trying to promote them. We've got ECOWAS in West Africa, we've got the Maghreb Union, we've got in Southern Africa, SADC, with the East African Community in West Africa, and we have these regional blocks in which we're trying to then collapse them and create one market. But do we have the institutions? Are those the right ones to enable us to create this one common market that we're talking about? So that one day when we speak, when we say 1 billion people, everybody in Africa knows we're talking about Africa and Africans.
Well, I think that we do have the regional frameworks, but the reason why we haven't been able to integrate our markets very successfully up to this point is because we must admit that those regional frameworks are deficient. If they were working well, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation.
Absolutely.
And so it goes to just how much individual member states are really ready to promote the integration agenda.
It's a word we call political willingness.
Political will, but it also has to do with the private sector as well. I mean, in a democracy, I can tell you that politics is the most demand-driven profession in the world, because at the end of the day, you're accountable to an electorate. But you also have the business community and some perhaps local advantages that have been obtained by not having your markets open up that much. And so you want to maintain those advantages. So it's a combination of stakeholders working together to really make this happen, because we collectively believe that it is in our better interest. Mr. Megashi was giving the example of the Aflao border, which is the border between Ghana and Togo.
Indeed.
And a lot of the behavior that goes on along that border that is illegal is rent-seeking. Now, it's not just a question of saying, you know, we're going to implement protocols that we have agreed on decades ago, but making sure that you're actually ready to call people to account for not behaving the way that they're expected to do. It requires government also to be a lot more efficient than it has been. My thinking is that for as long as we continue along the path of democratization, openness, discussion, having ourselves accountable to our citizenry, we are compelled to do this because, as I said, the public demands it. And so that's the reason why I think that it's important for us to open up this discussion, not just at the level of political leadership, because that's just formal. It has to involve our private sector in a much more meaningful way to get some of these things moving, as well as individual nation states.
But Minister, how do we get the politicians to work together when we know that by making them work together to a degree we supplant the need for many of them? Because if we then break down the national governments that we have and talk about the regional trading blocs as the political institutions that we need to drive this process forward, of course it means, you know, jobs will be lost not just in the private sector but now certainly in government and the top echelons. How do we make the politicians think in terms of the national long-term good at the expense of the short-term presence of the here and now today?
Because sometimes the short-term presence of the here and now demands your immediate attention. And I'll be a bit more specific. When you look at the size of Ghana as an economy, and you look at a country like Togo, the fact of the matter is that we are a bigger economy. We also do have more manufacturing than they do, even though I'd be the first to say it's not enough. And when you compare across countries, the question is, how do they raise revenue? And most countries, especially within my sub-region, raise government revenue from trade taxes because the internal revenue is not as efficient. Value-added tax systems or other indirect tax systems are not as efficient. And the easiest way to generate that revenue is from your trade taxes along the border. It's one of the reasons why we haven't been able to be that effective about it. So you have to approach it from the point of view of not how do we get the politicians to talk to each other, though that is part of it, but how do we make sure that our government systems of raising revenue are more effective such that you can take the long-term view, because your short-term challenges are also going to be addressed through the other sources of revenue you've raised. Within ECOWAS, this is our big challenge.
Minister Davis, the minister here says it's about systems, not so much about the politicians thinking about themselves. But when we look at what happened in Europe, the European experiment has to a degree failed. And part of the reason has been laid squarely at the door of the politicians, because some of the policies that they agreed have not worked. In Africa, we have the advantage that we are coming and seeing a model that we have used and pursued to try to create the regional trading blocks that we need has in part failed, and we have a chance to learn. But is there enough there for us? And do we have new ideas that we bring in to ensure that we don't fall into the pitfalls of Europe?
Well, I think that we are beginning to grapple with some of those matters in an appropriate way, I would argue. I think that the challenge we face is that to too great an extent, African countries and Africa is producers of things they don't consume, primary products, and we are consumers of things that we don't produce, and that's the imbalance we've got. And we need bigger markets and a bigger domestic base to support that shift into much more productive activity. So I think that, for example, the broadening of integration across the three regions is a perfectly feasible project if we do not try to encumber it with too much ambition around the institutional level. So we can establish a free trade agreement, by extending the free trade arrangements we have among ourselves to a bigger area. We can do it. It's doable. Having said that, I think that the conceptual framework that is informing us here is telling us that we are not Europe. We don't have what Jacob Weiner in his book on the theory of customs unions in the 1950s, which to a large extent informed the integration process. We don't have high levels of complementarity between our economies. We don't have a situation where there is an easy, simple outcome from trade integration arrangements on their own. That we've got to address some of the very hard issues, infrastructure development, cooperation around some of the real economy issues, and then I think also this basket of matters of other regulations which we put under the rubric of trade facilitation. Because when South African businesses come and talk to us about the difficulties they have in doing business in other countries or taking goods across borders, it's actually very little to do with tariffs. It's very little to do with any matter that's going to be solved by some kind of movement further forward in tariff negotiations. It's got everything to do with things like transport regulations, systems that don't talk to each other, inadequacies in the border arrangements and long times it takes to cross borders. Those are the kind of matters. And I do agree with Minister Teta that we're going to have to hold people accountable. We're a bit lax. We agree on things and then somebody doesn't implement it and there are no consequences. And I think we do need to start to insist that there is actually delivery on what we agree. So I think these are the sort of steps that we have to have. What we need to do is we need to move in bite-sized chunks. If we try to imitate Europe and we try to say, well, Europe's got monetary union, let's have monetary union, let's put ourselves a tight time frame, we'll have it in a very short space of time. Yeah. Well, the conditions don't exist on the ground in Africa. They don't exist on the ground in Europe for some of the members of the Eurozone. That's the problem they've got in Europe. Some of the members of the Eurozone do not have the real conditions to be part of that. If they save the Eurozone, it'll be because one economy has got a huge amount of resources, or some economies have got a huge amount of resources that can bail the whole thing out. But if it falls apart, it's going to set back the whole European integration arrangement, and it's only going to be saved because countries have got many more resources than us to bail it out. So I think we need to avoid these big heroic leaps into institutional arrangements that we can't actually follow through with. We need to go in bite-sized chunks, and I think actually the tripartite is moving in that sort of way, and I think it's therefore appropriate and an important initiative.
Yeah. Minister Mashakada, are we on the right track? Is that the answer? Do we not need to reinvent the wheel?
Well, I think the first premise is that when you look at regional integration or continental integration of the three blocks, ask yourself, what is tradable? And then you scale what is tradable rather than try to chew what you cannot swallow. Sure. I think the problem is that we are trying to introduce a lot of products in the equation. And whereas if we could scale down to one or two products, depending on the comparative advantage of these regions, then we zero in on those product lines and we pursue our integration based on those few selected trade lines rather than do everything at one go. That's one dimension. The second dimension is that we continue to think regionally or continentally, but still continue to act nationally. Whereas it should be the other way around. See, let's act regionally and continentally while still thinking nationally. So until such time that we reach that level of a paradigm shift, we continue to posture and posture, but I would like to acknowledge the efforts that have been put in place by the heads of governments and our ministers of trade to try to move this process faster than it has been in the past, because that's the only way to go, to act as one block rather than continue in our isolated regional blocks.
Mr. Magabshi, you want to come in?
I think, look, at the risk of being accused, a business person being accused of commenting on politics, I'd like to say the ministers have said a number of things around accountability and governance, and I think what has happened in the recent past across Africa has been the political and macroeconomic stability that governments have taken accountability for. I think there's a final leg, and is around developmental strategy stability. As governments change, the development agenda changes. And I think that's what's killing us in business. And with that, coming down to a more micro level rather than a macro level, the sort of things we talk about, executing on agreements that have been made in the past and make sense for going forward. And complementing Minister Davis's comments, we can't, you eat an elephant in little bite chunks. And I think we've got to start at the sub-regional level. And the interesting thing is the EAC, and my personal view is that there isn't a big elephant in that grouping.
Right.
It works a little better from a business person's perspective, from an integration viewpoint. And the work that Richard Sisabere, the Secretary General at EAC, is doing is commendable in looking at harmonization of regulation. He's the former health minister in Rwanda, and is using harmonization of pharmaceutical and medical regulation as a start to be able to get things going there, the road network and the infrastructure network. So I think we can't expect things to happen overnight. And I think we should commend the governments on the continent for where they are today, because we've come a long way from the bad days of the 80s, etc. But we've got to keep going forward and pick up the pace, particularly for business and small, medium enterprises, which actually form the bulk of employment on the continent. As Honorable Minister said before, there's 20% and 80% below the line. Yeah. I think we've got to understand a few things. 4 things that have been provided, but not in an integrated fashion. 1, access to information, and that's from markets to supplies or business opportunities, etc. Access to information. BEE, the business enabling environment, and by that registration, taxation, making it simple, etc.
The ability to apply for a company and get it approved in 3 days, like in Rwanda.
Absolutely. And access to finance, which everybody talks about. And coupled with that, capacity building. Various multilateral and bilateral agencies have provided 1 or 2 of these things in different programs. The key thing is for government and the private sector to come together and provide those 4 things in a consistent and coordinated fashion to be able to drive the growth of SMEs.
Is that at the national or regional level?
I think you've got to start nationally and regionally to create the markets. In East Africa, it's a lot easier because they're roughly about the same size. When you've got a big elephant in the group, it's counterintuitive to do that on a regional level. But if we want to make the continent progress, we're going to have to do that.
Indeed, we must continue that conversation, because right now we need to take a break because I must pay my bills. And when we come back after the break, we shall be finding out more from the Minister of Health if indeed the money that is being given to try and ensure that he's got the workers and the consumer that we need is enough.